In this video, we'll explore color grading with DaVinci Resolve. Our goal is to produce a natural-looking video file that is ready to be used as is, but still retains enough leeway for further adjustment by the customer as needed. Before we get started, keep in mind that as with all nonlinear editing systems, NLE for short, DaVinci Resolve is non-destructive. This means the original source footage is not modified while you are editing or color grading. The changes you make are only saved within the project file, leaving the original video file untouched. Let's start off with the Edit tab. First, we're going to bring our videos into the media pool in the top left. Now we'll drop them onto our timeline. These clips have been trimmed to our desired length in advance, but if you need help on how to do this, see our self-editing and selections video. Notice that I have included a video clip containing color bars. We'll refer to this later. Now let's move on to the Color tab. The key thing to keep in mind when color grading is that you can't always rely on your computer monitor to show the colors accurately. Also, most monitors don't have the ability to show you the full range of color information that has been captured by your camera. Therefore, it's important to use scopes to accurately assess the footage. Scopes provide exact representations of the elements that make up your image. They can be used to check your white balance, exposure, curves, and more. As you make adjustments, the readings on the scopes change so that you can evaluate the impact of the changes you are making. If you are new to video, but an experienced photographer, the histogram is an example of a commonly used scope in photography. Let's start with a video of the solar panels. First, we'll break out our scopes so we can see them at the same time. The three that we'll be focusing on today include the waveform, which displays the brightness of an image, the parade, which is similar to the waveform, but split into three primary colors, red, green, and blue, also known as RGB, and the vector scope, a circular reference display which visualizes the color information or chrominance of an image. The histogram is also active on the bottom right for reference. Let's go into our scope settings and activate the Display Qualifier Focus function. This allows us to use our qualifier tool to help us identify where a particular point of the image falls on each scope. We're also going to activate the low pass filter. This smooths out the video signal, reducing noise and making the scopes easier to read. The waveform monitor is the first one we'll look at. It's an effective way to evaluate brightness. The waveform in Resolve defaults to show 10-bit full-range data levels of 0 to 1023. At the bottom of the vertical axis, we see 0, which is pure black, while at the top, 1023 represents pure white. While you can work with full-range data levels, any files exported for broadcast or web should fit within the 10-bit video levels of 64 to 940, which is a Rec. 709 broadcast standard. If leaving the waveform settings in full-range data, Resolve will adjust the data range of your content for you when exporting your file, but we'd suggest getting into the habit of working within the standard 10-bit video levels of 64 to 940. First, let's change our waveform scale style from data level to video level. This hasn't affected the image in our video file, but it has changed how the levels are represented in the waveform. We don't have any markers for the key boundaries of 64 or 940, so let's do that now by activating the indicators for those levels. Open Waveform Settings, then activate Show Reference Levels. Next, set Low to 64 and High to 940. Notice the reference lines are now represented in our waveform. What we see on the horizontal axis is the image itself. This makes it easier to see where a particular part of the image falls on the waveform. Left is left and right is right. As we play the video, we can see the bright panels move in contrast with the darker grass. Let's see how the waveform looks on the video of the young woman in her home. You can see the three windows represented by the higher levels on the waveform. When we play the video, we can see the model's hand move, as well as the point where her head moves in front of one of the windows. Moving back to the video of the solar panels, let's use our scopes to adjust white balance. If you look at our qualifier as we pass around the image, you can see how there are 3 little circles representing red, green, and blue in the waveform. Those 3 circles should align to become a single white circle whenever we are looking at something pure white or pure black. Notice how there is a clipping point where the sun reflects off the solar panels the hardest, and there is no detail remaining. This clipping point is represented on our waveform as a sharp horizontal line at the top of the highlights. It looks like a mountain with the peak chopped off. Even as we bring our exposure down, the sharp horizontal line remains, as that data is outside of what the camera could record based on the capture settings that were used. This gives us a solid point of reference, since it should be pure white. When I move the qualifier over the top of that, we can see the 3 circles align to become one. We know our white is properly balanced here. Now let's take a look at the parade scope where we can see the waveform broken out into RGB. Notice how the red, green, and blue clipping line is quite level. Now watch as I adjust the color temperature, and you can see the red and blue levels shifting up and down relative to each other. When the clipping point in the red is higher than the blue, the image is too warm. When the clipping point in blue is higher than the red, the image is too cool. Take note of what the qualifier circles are doing in our waveform as well. The temp adjustment moves the red and blue circles out of alignment with each other. Let's get ourselves balanced again, and then we'll look at what happens when we adjust the tint. When the green clipping point is higher than the red and the blue, the image veers green. When it's too low, the image veers to magenta. Again, referring back to the qualifier circles in our waveform, we can see the tint moves the green circle out of alignment with both red and blue. Let's get these levels balanced with each other. Keep in mind that the balancing method shown here works because the video we are using contains something that is pure white. If the shot was of a single primary color like green grass, the greens would logically be quite a bit higher than blue or red. There is another scope that is very useful for determining color, and that is the vector scope. With visually complex files that have a wide range of color, vector scope readings can be difficult to understand at first glance. For a clear introduction on how to understand these readings, let's look at how color bars are represented on the vector scope. Designed as a standardized broadcast test pattern, the color bars provide a clean visual to illustrate exactly where each color lands in a vector scope reading. Moving clockwise from the top of the vector scope, we can see red, magenta, blue, cyan, green, and yellow, all marked with an individual box. The center represents white. Let's look at how shifting the color temperature and the tint throws the color points outside their respective boxes, in addition to moving the white point out of the center. Now let's get everything balanced again. Let's move back to our solar panel video. First, we're going to go into our vector scope settings and activate the 2x zoom function, which zooms in the vector scope. Then we're going to adjust the brightness of the vector scope and the graticule. Both of these functions help us see our readings clearly so that we can make an accurate assessment. Looking at the vector scope, as expected, we see white in the center. We can also see this section to the lower left here, which represents the green grass. This section just to the lower right of center represents the cyan and blue in the solar panels. Let's watch what happens when we adjust the color temperature and tint. Now let's get everything centered again before moving on. To illustrate another useful function of the vector scope, let's have a look at the video with a close-up of the woman in front of the colorful background. We're going to go back into our vector scope settings and activate the skin tone indicator. This indication line shows the area in the vector scope where the skin tone should be. This is effective for all people regardless of skin color. As you can see, our skin tones are a little green. We'll simply adjust our tint towards magenta to ensure that the skin tone is balanced. In some instances, it can be harder to make out where the skin tone falls on the vector scope. If we want to check where we are at, we can activate the highlight mode of our viewer and use a qualifier to swipe across the model's forehead to isolate the skin tone like so. Notice how much easier it is to locate the skin tone in the vector scope. Remember to undo to remove the qualifier from this node before moving on, as otherwise, any adjustments you made within this node will only be applied to what has been qualified, the model's forehead in this instance. Returning to the video of the young woman in her home, we can see it was captured as log, which is a flat color profile designed to capture as much information as possible. Shooting in log is an effective way to ensure that you are getting the most out of your camera. However, the trade-off is that the image has very low contrast to protect shadow and highlight detail, as well as low saturation to prevent any clipping in bright colors. The image will need to be color graded before the video is presentable. While using a log profile is different from capturing raw video, it is similar in that it is designed to require further processing before it can be used. One of the simplest ways to get a head start is to apply a preset called a LUT. A LUT, which stands for Lookup Table, is a preset color grade saved as a template. There are many LUTs available, both generic and versions tailored to work best with specific cameras. We recommend using a neutral LUT so that the clip is ready to use, but still retains enough flexibility to allow for further adjustments as necessary. Since this video was captured using a Blackmagic Design Ursa Mini Pro, we will apply the LUT titled Blackmagic Design Film to Extended Video V4. Sometimes the LUT is all you need, but sometimes the video file will still need a little work. Notice that in this case, applying the LUT alone has resulted in the model being underexposed. Looking at the waveform, our highlights and shadows aren't too far off, but our midtones are a bit crushed, as there is too much data in the left and center of frame squeezed in with our shadows near the bottom. Before we start making adjustments, let's look at nodes. Nodes are used in a similar fashion to layers in Photoshop. Keeping your numerous adjustments broken out into various nodes will help you keep track of what changes you made where. I'm going to add a new node to separate these adjustments from the LUT I applied in the first node. To differentiate my nodes, I'm going to label the first node LUT and the second node Primaries. Organization is key. Our primaries include color wheels for lift, which primarily adjusts our shadows, gamma, which primarily adjusts our midtones, gain, which primarily adjusts our highlights, and offset, which adjusts the whole tonal range. You'll notice that the color wheels look similar to the log wheels, which include shadows, midtones, highlights, and offset. While offset between the two types of wheels performs exactly the same, the other three corresponding wheels have a key difference. The log wheels will only adjust their respective tonal range, while the color wheels have overlap. For example, the color wheel lift will primarily adjust shadows, but to a lesser extent will also affect midtones and highlights. The log wheel shadow will only affect shadows while leaving midtones and highlights alone. Unless you have a specific reason, we generally recommend using the color wheels, as it's easier to produce a balanced image. Now let's make those adjustments to our primaries in our new node. I'm going to adjust my gamma to bring up my midtones. Our model is starting to look much better here, but as you can see in their tights, the shadows have gotten a little washed out. I'm going to adjust my lift a small amount to bring my blacks back down. My highlights are looking good, so I'll leave the gain where it is. Now let's add a little contrast to help the image pop. Remember, a little goes a long way. We still want to maintain a neutral look. Let's work on our white balance next. We're going to create a new node and label it WB for white balance. If we look at our peak highlights in our windows, our levels are looking quite balanced. However, we've got a mixed lighting situation here, with the warm tungsten light on the model and the cool daylight coming in the windows. The white balance was set in camera for the window light, and this has resulted in the model's skin tones becoming quite warm. We're going to cool the image off a little to get a more even white balance on the model. We are still going to leave a little bit of warmth, as we don't want to completely remove the aesthetic choice of using the warm tungsten lighting on the model. As you can see in the waveform, this adjustment has resulted in the windows and the daylight reflecting off the flooring to go a little cool. But the model's skin tones are much more natural. Let's use the version and original feature to see where we are at. The difference between a log and a graded video file is striking. While we've added enough in the grade to make the clip stand out, what's important is that we use our scopes to ensure we aren't throwing any detail away unnecessarily. This is important to add versatility for the end use of the customer. Let's move to the Deliver tab, where we can export our videos. The first thing we are going to do is set our export location. Next, we will set Render to individual clips. We'll stick with QuickTime under Format and then choose Apple ProRes under Codec. When selecting the type, ProRes 4444 and ProRes 422HQ are the highest quality, but will have very large file sizes. ProRes 422 and ProRes 422LT will have more manageable file sizes, but at the cost of higher compression. Think of the ProRes types like JPEG compression sizes in a digital photo camera. ProRes 4444 is the equivalent of Superfine, ProRes 422HQ would be Fine, ProRes 422 Normal, and ProRes 422LT Basic. If exporting as H.264, we could select either QuickTime or MP4 for format. We recommend setting the bitrate to 100,000 kilobytes per second for standard 4K content, setting the encoding profile to high, and activating the multipass encode function. When we move to the Audio tab, we can deselect Export Audio. While you may have video files accepted with audio, it's generally preferable to remove it. Audio must be both relevant to the subject and recorded at a high standard of quality, otherwise it just becomes a distraction for the customer. Moving to the File tab, we can decide on how our files will be named. We can choose a custom name or stick with the original source names. We'll click on Add to Render Queue in the bottom left. Then once we are ready, we will click Render All and let our computer go to work generating new color-graded versions of our videos. And remember, the grade hasn't changed the original source footage, so you'll still have an untouched version of your video. We hope this tutorial has been helpful. Thanks for watching, and remember to check out the other videos in this series.